Listen, let's be really honest here. Catholic Austro-Libertarianism is a bust. Period. This idea has been exposed time and time again, both by the Church and by those faithful souls wishing only to conform themselves to her wisdom. The magisterium has not been silent in this regard. In fact, it's repeatedly refuted so many of the very principles and policies revered by Austro-Libertarians. Whether it's on matters such as, let's say, human nature, economic law, subsidiarity, social justice, even the appropriate role of the state in social matters and economic activities, the Church has spoken, and the Church has spoken authoritatively. Now sure, we have emperors without clothing throwing rocks at the throne of St. Peter all the time. But the fact is this, the Church continues to stand tall as the king of the hill. This is the way it's always been. This is the way it will always be, no matter what dissenters may claim. But let's be really honest here. The truth in this matter is actually rather simple. I think, though, that that's probably part of the problem, because this controversy doesn't really bear the marks of nuance and ambiguity that's appreciated by those who work tirelessly at mixing oil and water. I talked about this in a previous post entitled A Resolved Tension. It was posted on the Distributist review. In it, I discussed the Church's position regarding her competency over social matters and economic activities, and concluded, along with the Church, that it admits of no doubt. Now, we all know that there are individuals who deny as much. But denying as much is not a legitimate divergence of theological opinion. Instead, just call it what it is. It's a matter of public dissent. When push comes to shove, the only real unresolved tension at play here is the one that reigns in the hearts and minds of Austro-Libertarians, deeming it best to exchange Catholic birthright for Austrian porridge. I don't want this to be marginalized here as distributist huff-puffery, so let's consider, just for a moment, let's consider what Pope John the 23rd said in his 1961 encyclical, Mother and Teacher. The pontiff was quite aware that there were those who would dissent, and that these individuals would dissent publicly. This really isn't at all surprising. There's nothing new under the sun, after all. So, in his brilliance, he headed them off with words of warning and of admonition. And I'd like to just take a second here and quote from paragraph 239. And this is what he said, quote, "In their economic and social activities, Catholics often come into contact with others who do not share their view of life. In such circumstances, they must, of course, bear themselves as Catholics and do nothing to compromise religion and morality. Yet at the same time, they should show themselves animated by a spirit of understanding and unselfishness, ready to cooperate loyally in achieving objects which are good in themselves or can be turned into good. Needless to say, when the hierarchy has made a decision on any point, Catholics are bound to obey their directives. The Church has the right and obligation not merely to guard ethical and religious principles, but also to declare its authoritative judgment in the matter of putting these principles into practice." End quote. In an effort to evade this obligation, something that they do all the time, Catholic Austro-Libertarians have marginalized these most basic and ruling assumptions of the pontiff regarding the competency of the Church's social teaching. Rather than trusting the Church, dissenters always construct the most curious arguments against the legitimacy of such considerations and judgments. This forces them into what I believe to be a rather unfortunate conundrum, and that is that they pit the Church's claims against their own. But doing as much really does lead to these kind of inevitable considerations that very few people think about. And in this regard, those considerations would be those pertaining to whether the Church's insistence on these matters, whether or not it's immoral. Okay? Is it an abuse of legitimate papal prerogative? Is it an abuse of the office of the papacy? And is it abusive and tyrannical for the magisterium to speak in a way as if it's authoritative when in fact it's powerless to direct men's lives? Those are questions that need to be asked. Those are questions that are inevitable when discussing this with Austro-Libertarians. Now, predictably, dissenters never go so far as to declare as much. At least they rarely ever do. But in all honesty, they really do declare as much, and I think that they know it. And I think that it doesn't really take much for us to see how this plays itself out. Let's consider here what was said by Thomas E. Woods, Jr. in an essay I mentioned in my article. The essay is entitled Catholic Social Theory and Economic Law, an Unresolved Tension. Now listen to what he says regarding what he believes to be an unresolved tension between so-called economic law and the Church's social teaching. Now, once again, keep in mind here that he has insisted the Catholic Austro-Libertarians, and I'll quote him here, hesitate to describe Catholic social teaching as an abuse of papal and ecclesial power. So once again, he hesitates. At least that's what he claims. He hesitates to describe Catholic social teaching as an abuse of papal and ecclesial power. But listen to what he says here, and I'll quote him again. By any definition, it lay well beyond the competence of the magisterium to presume to describe the workings of economic relationships, end quote. Now he'd add to this a little gem here by concluding, and I'll quote again, at the very least, it appears to constitute an indefensible extension of the prerogatives of the Church's legitimate teaching office into areas which it possesses no inherent competence or divine protection from error, end quote. Well, so much for hesitation, Mr. Woods. So much for hesitation here. I mean, this is, for all intents and purposes, public dissent. Would he and others embracing his position admit as much? Well, probably not. But if we're honest with ourselves, there are very few dissenters who actually do. So let's get back here real quick to Mother and Teacher. Okay, John the 23rd, he knew that such dissenting opinions existed in his day. And while his words, at the time they were written for a contemporary audience, the wisdom and the applicability of what he had to say is timeless. Concerning the lay faithful, he insisted that those things touched on by the Church's social teaching must be implemented, and it must be done so with trust and obedience. And I'll quote here from paragraph 241 of Mother and Teacher. Quote, their attitude must be one of loyal trust and filial obedience to ecclesiastical authority. They must remember, too, that if in the transaction of their temporal affairs they take no account of those social principles which the Church teaches, and which we now confirm, then they fail in their obligations and may easily violate the rights of others. They may even go so far as to bring discredit on the Church's teaching, lending substance to the opinion that, in spite of its intrinsic value, it is in fact powerless to direct men's lives. End quote. This, my friends, is the rub. Okay? This is the rub. This is exactly what is going on. And the position advocated by Catholic Austro-Libertarians concerning the competency of the Church's social teaching, it's not merely lending substance to this already unfortunate opinion. No, it's leading the charge. More than this, their dissent is chalked up not so much as an acceptable expression of obedience, but the most preferable expression of obedience. I mean, come on. Nothing like adding insult to injury here, folks. Seriously. Thankfully, people are beginning to figure out what's really going on here. Faithful Catholics are beginning to seriously reconsider their most basic and ruling assumptions, and doing so in an effort to better conform themselves to the teachings of Holy Mother Church. This is true both in regards to their thoughts and their deeds. There's an ever-increasing number of individuals here who've chosen wisely in favor of trust and obedience, and they're laying to rest that unfortunate and unnecessary unresolved tension. But what we see of them, we can only hope and pray regarding others. Okay? We have to believe that maybe, just maybe, one day as much could be said about those pundits who've chosen Austrian porridge over their Catholic birthright.